It was even more pronounced in the north, where only Colonel Udo and his men stood between the Marine divisions and their objectives. For the first, with its memories of fierce battle, the Great Lu Chu was an unbelievable but lovely frolic. In the afternoon, General Del Valle called a press conference to tell the correspondents, "I don't know where the Japs are, and I can't offer you any good reason why they let us come ashore so easily. We're pushing on across the island as fast as we can move the men and equipment." They were, and in 2 days of fighting, the first's casualties totaled 3 dead and 18 wounded. On April 3rd, the division's jubilant Marines stood on the eastern seawall overlooking the bay and the Pacific Ocean. That same day, scouting parties entered the narrow finger of the Kachin Peninsula, traversing it without opposition. Encouraged, General Buckner lifted all restrictions on the rampaging first, and the division rapidly secured all the east coast between Yontan Airfield and the Ishikawa Isthmus, that narrow neck of land about 2 miles wide, lying 2/5 of the way up Okinawa's slender length. In 4 days, the first had taken territory expected to require 3 weeks of savage fighting. To the north, the 6th was running into steadily stiffening opposition, ambushes and isolated attacks on strongpoints, skirmishes real enough to those who fought in them, especially those who died or fell wounded, but not in sufficient strength to slow the 6th's rapid advance. After the division had sealed off the northern side of Ishikawa, its men started marching north for Zampa Cape at route-step speed. The 1st would clean up behind the 6th, and also attend to the problem of the Okinawan refugees now clogging the roads. There were so many of them, women with babies at their breasts, children without parents, grizzle-bearded ancients hobbling along with bent backs, leaning on staffs and carrying pitiful small bundles representing all that the war had left them. That terrible war that had also robbed them of the authority of their beards and had exposed them to Japanese mockery and American pity. And the old white-haired women who could not walk, who merely squatted in the road, shriveled, frail, hardly bigger than monkeys, waiting to be carried, waiting for the kind Marine who might stop and stick a lighted cigarette between their toothless gums. They were a docile people, and now they were terrified because the Japanese had told them the Americans would torture them. They were frightened also because they knew that among them were Japanese soldiers disguised as civilians. But their fear vanished with gentle treatment, with the policy of carefully searching all males between 15 and 45, to discover many a knife or cartridge belt beneath a smock, and of placing all of these within prisoner-of-war camps. Soon the Okinawans were speaking openly of their hatred for the Japanese, their loathing for the reign of radiant peace. "Nippon ga maketa," they said. "Japan is finished." Marines of the 6th Division were still marching rapidly north, sweeping up both coasts, a regiment to either side, and making giant strides daily. Tanks packed with grinning riflemen rolled up the narrow, dusty roads unimpeded but for an occasional sniper, a hastily built and unforbidding roadblock that bulldozers or the tanks themselves could easily shove aside, or here and there an obviously freshly planted landmine that could be detonated with a well-aimed rifle shot. On April 8th, the tanks in the lead came to the mouth of the Motobu Peninsula, a wild headland jutting into the East China Sea on the left or west of the Marines. Here the Americans discovered why it was that they had moved so easily north. On Motobu were gathered almost all of the 2,000 soldiers remaining to Colonel Udo. They were holed up on 1,200-foot Mount Yaitake, among the well-chosen and well-fortified labyrinth of cave-eaten ridges, cliffs, gorges, steep hills and rocky corridors, well supplied with guns, prepared to fight to the end. The Marines moved in. They pushed cautiously around the coastal roads, their engineers swiftly building bridges over the ruins of those demolished by the Japanese, or trucking in loads of rock and dirt to fill tank traps blasted at the foot of cliffs or out in the rice paddies. By April 13th, they had driven the Japanese back onto the crest of the Yaitake stronghold. They were prepared to attack in a pincers, 3 battalions to begin a fighting climb from Motobu's west coast, 2 to strike from the east. With first light on Friday the 13th on Okinawa, these Marines of the 6th Division were startled, then grief-stricken, to hear the bullhorns of the ships offshore blaring, "Attention! Attention! All hands! President Roosevelt is dead! Repeat, our Supreme Commander, President Roosevelt is dead!" Swiftly the news reached the men out of earshot. Many of them cried, most of them prayed. So many of these youths had known no president other than Franklin Delano Roosevelt. They had truly loved him, had depended on him. How much they did not know until they heard that he was dead. Nor could they turn for solace to company officers, barely a few years their senior. They could ask only, "What do we do now?" Memorial services might be possible on ships even now flying the flag at half-mast, but the Marines on Motobu could do nothing but move out. The Yaetek attacks became a week-long nightmare against a phantom enemy. Everywhere in the hills were small groups of Japanese clustering around a Hotchkiss heavy machine gun and the usual proliferation of Nambu lights. Marines might grenade these nasty spitting nests, might call down exact mortar fire, but then, in the succeeding rush, might find nothing but a trail of blood to suggest that anyone had struck at them. "Geez!" a Marine swore. "They've all got Nambus, but where the hell are they?" On April 15th, naval gunfire and close-up airstrikes grew stronger. More artillery was brought in. Artillery observers went forward, among them a battery commander and his spotter, PFC, Harold Gonsalves. The commander lived because Gonsalves hurled himself on a Japanese grenade to save him and win the Medal of Honor. 7 more and more guns lashed at Yaetake. Next day the Marines drove deeper into the Japanese complex. Corporal Richard Bush led a squad forward on the right flank of the 3-battalion line, striking at Yaetake's eastern mass. The face of the opposing ridge erupted with gunfire. Bush's squad went up and over it to drive the Japanese out, to score the first breakthrough. But Bush was badly wounded. He was pulled back to a cluster of protecting rocks where other men lay. A grenade sailed in. Bush pulled it to him. He saved the other wounded, and he also lived, to join that amazing company of Marines whose medals of honor testified to the toughness of their bodies. Through the hole his squad had cut, through other holes along the line, the fight marched upward, swirling up in the mountains where it became as much a matter of supply as killing the enemy. Marines toiled up hills with 5-gallon cans of water on their backs and bandoliers of rifle clips or grenades slung crisscross about their bodies. Battalion commanders going up to inspect the lines brought a water can or a mortar shell along with them. It was 4 days before the Marines burst into Colonel Udo's headquarters to discover this mimeographed sheet intended for their eyes. Saturday, April 14th, President Roosevelt died a sudden death to the men of the 6th Marine Division. We take it a great honour to speak to you for the first time. We are awfully sorry to learn from the UP Telegraph that the life of President Roosevelt has suddenly come to its end at 3:30 p.m. on April 12th. It seems to be an incredible story in spite of its actual evidence. Men of the 6th Marine Division, particularly men of the 15th and 29th Marines and the 3rd Amphibious Corps, we express our hearty regret with you all over the death of the late President. What do you think was the true cause of the late President's death? A miserable defeat experienced by the US forces in the sea around the island of Okinawa? Were this not the direct cause leading him to death, we could be quite relieved. We do not think that the majority of you have exact knowledge of the present operations being carried out by the US forces, although a very few member of you must have got a glimpse of the accurate situation. An exceedingly great number of picked aircraft carriers, battleships, cruisers and destroyers held their course to and near the Sea of Okinawa in order to protect you and carry out operations in concert with you. 90% of them have already been sunk and destroyed by Japanese special fighting bodies, sea and air. In this way, a grand US sea-bottom fleet numbering 500 has been brought into existence around this little island. Once you have seen a lizard twitching about with its tail cut off, we suppose this state of the lizard is likened to you. Even a drop of blood can never be expected from its own heart. As a result, an apoplectic stroke comes to attack. It is a sort of vice, however, to pressure upon others' unhappiness. This is why we want to write nothing further. It is time now for you, sagacious and prudent, however, to look over the whole situations of the present war and try to catch a chance for reflection. The Marines went on to conquer the rest of Motobu, securing the peninsula on April 20th. Above them, the 6th Division's 22nd Regiment had reached Okinawa's northernmost point. The biggest battle in the northern sector was over. The 6th spent the rest of April patrolling and pursuing those Japanese who had fled Yaitake and turned irregular, using war dogs to scent the enemy and bark a warning. They even found that natural enemy of whom they had had such ample, ominous warning. "Look at the snake I just killed. It's one of them Habu." "Who what?" "Habu, the snake they was all talking about before we landed." "What are you going to do with it?" "Do with it? With the slop they've been feeding us on this screwy island? I'm going to cut it into fillets and then I'm going to fry it and eat it." Marines of the 1st Division were not quite so desperate. They were, in fact, still celebrating the honeymoon, extending it for the duration of the month of April. Many of the division's battalions built bivouacs complete with gravel paths, showers, and mess halls. The men went to abandoned Okinawan homes to remove the sliding panels that separated the rooms. They used them for foxhole covers or to build shanties. Everybody had a pet, a pony, a goat, even one of those numerous Okinawan rabbits that might have escaped the pot. There was an open-air theatre at division headquarters, and there all the clerks and typists gathered nightly to play leapfrog until it was dark enough for a movie. This was not battle as the first had known it, but the men said, "Peace, it's wonderful." They were so enchanted by lilac time that they brewed jungle juice out of their rations, drank it from borrowed lacquerware, one of Okinawa's few crafts, and began to harmonise. They sang all the old favourites such as the Wabash Cannonball or Birmingham Jail, as well as that vast repertoire of bawdies and unprintables collected or composed by local bards during 3 years of tramping the Pacific. There was a new printable one for Okinawa, and it went, "Oh, don't you worry, Mother, your son is safe out here. No Japs on Okinawa, no sake, booze or beer. Your sons can't find no nips, so we're going back on ships. But don't you worry, Mother, 'cause we're going on another." But they were not. The honeymoon was ending. They were staying on Okinawa and going south, down to that Nahashuri-Yonabaru line that had stopped the Army's 24th Corps. In the meantime, Admiral Ugaki had hurled the first of his kikusui, or floating chrysanthemums, aerial strikes on the American warships surrounding Okinawa, while Admiral Soemu Toyoda, Navy Chief of Staff, had also ordered Great Yamato, the mightiest warship ever built, to join these kamikaze attacks as a suicide battleship. In Japan, the chrysanthemum is probably the most beloved of all flowers, woven into wreaths for weddings and funerals alike, decorating graves, or dropped by grieving pilots onto waters in which their dearest comrades had plunged to their death. Thus, in conformance with this custom among the flower-loving Nipponese, Admiral Matome Ugaki decided to give the scheduled Tengo aerial attacks on American shipping the name of kikusui, or floating chrysanthemums. Although Ugaki's aerial strength on Kyushu had been seriously weakened by Halsey's strikes of mid-October 1944, and especially by Spruance's sweeps of March 18-19, 1945, he still had well over 3,000 planes, both conventional and suiciders, in his command after the Americans landed on Okinawa. Ugaki had few reservations about his ability to shatter the enemy fleet and so delay or even prevent the invasion of Japan proper, but he did occasionally despair about the absence of coordination and cooperation among the Army and Navy subordinate air commanders on both Formosa and Kyushu. Though the Japanese command structure was probably better unified for Okinawa than for any other operation thus far, it was still a most casual chain of command in which the last thing a subordinate commander in, say, the Army would think of doing was to obey an order from a superior in the Navy. At best, to them, an order was no better than a suggestion. Thus, army and navy commanders on those two great island fortresses neither cooperated with each other nor followed directives from the combined fleet or Imperial Army headquarters in Tokyo. Although there was indeed intense and divisive rivalry between the American Army and Navy in the Pacific, orders from superiors were never, or at least seldom, ignored. If Fleet Admiral Nimitz issued orders to Admiral Turner off Okinawa, he transmitted them to General Buckner, who obeyed them without question. Admiral Ugaki enjoyed no such luxury. If he wanted Lieutenant General Michio Sugahara, commander of the 6th Air Army on Kyushu, to take some action, he would not issue an order, but rather send a diplomatic officer to Sugahara's headquarters to explain in the least offensive language what was being required of him. Such deference, of course, did not forge the Japanese chain of command with iron links, and it also wasted valuable time, for Ugaki was based at Kanoya and Sugahara at Chiran. Nor could he ask Admiral Toyoda's fleet to issue an order binding on both of them. All that Ugaki could do was to send orders to a pair of Army air divisions that made most of the Okinawa attacks, although even here they were sometimes ignored. It is possible that this deference by senior officers to their subordinates was the result of Japanese misunderstanding of the character of Western military officers. When Japan decided to build the Imperial Navy, the model was the British Royal Navy, and the innate courtesy of its officers was mistaken for reticence. Thus an admiral might hesitate to insist that a commander give unbending obedience to his orders, lest it be considered rude. Ugaki had a second problem in organizing his forthcoming Kikusui attacks: how to strike a balance between undertraining and overtraining his kamikaze. Overtraining a pilot in the sense of turning him into a skillful combat flyer would be a wasted effort when all that was needed was to guide an obsolete aircraft to its target and then crash dive it. But suicide attacking wasn't that simple, especially in the North Pacific springtime when the weather was so variable, with conflicting wind currents, poor visibility and low ceilings. In such weather, even an experienced pilot could become lost. For a rookie pilot to keep a bomb-loaded crate on a direct course was not enough, for he still might not find his target. In such unreliable planes, engine trouble was frequent, and the student pilot needed to be trained enough to return successfully to base. But a new recruit would not emerge as a qualified suicider until months later. This requirement put an unbearable burden on Ugaki's attempt to build up a powerful air armada. The suicide tactic for which this force was being formed was not only innately self-destructive, but also time-consuming. Japan, in the spring of 1945, could not afford to lose more months of what had become a fast-vanishing resource. Finally, the American seaborne aerial attacks on Kyushu and Formosa, as well as the Mariana-based B-29 strikes on Kyushu and to a lesser degree of MacArthur's 5th Air Force on Formosa, along with the willingness of the suicide saviors to take their own lives, had left Ugaki with nothing like the minimal 4,000 aircraft he needed to destroy or cripple Spruance's 5th Fleet. That was one reason why Ugaki's airplanes did not immediately strike the Americans the day the invasion began, and it was not until that very day that Admiral Toyoda in Tokyo ordered Kikusui-1 to be launched on April 6th. That morning dawned overcast, with northeast winds whipping a mackerel sea into a white-crested grey mass, pushing layers of smutty clouds scudding along at altitudes of 3,000 to 7,000 feet. It was good kamikaze weather, providing them with excellent cover. Yet Rear Admiral Toshiyuki Yokoi, whom Ugaki had placed in charge of the Kikusui attacks, waited until around noon before sending his squadrons aloft, hoping thereby to catch patrolling American fighters at that most dangerous moment of refueling, either on carrier decks or the aprons of Yontan and Kadena airfields. It was a good idea that may have come to Yokoi by his recollection of how Yamamoto's carriers at Midway were struck at exactly that moment. But there would be no such surprise, for Spruance's task force commanders had long since installed the routine of keeping defensive fighter patrols aloft from sunup till sundown. Nor did Yokoi's ruse of dropping window, aluminum strips to create false blips on radar screens to lure American fighters away from the impact area, for radar operators picked them up almost as soon as they were dropped. Both Spruance and Turner were aware that a massive enemy aerial strike would arrive that day, not only from warnings from intelligence officers reading messages in the broken Japanese code, but through combat instincts sharpened by years of experience. Once the enemy had collected enough planes, he would strike. To thwart him, Turner had deployed a wide circle of 16 radar picket destroyers, like irregular-length spokes in a wheel winding around Okinawa and some of its surrounding islands. These spokes extended from Point Bolo, a reference point on that Zampa Cape he had so ardently desired, and which had been presented to him by the 6th Marine Division. Each radar picket could give early warning of an enemy attack, and also carried a 5-member radar direction team trained in vectoring patrolling fighters onto bogies, unidentified targets. As might be expected, the pickets would become prime targets of the attacking enemy, especially radar picket stations 1 through 4, on duty on an arc about 30 miles north of Okinawa, the point over which enemy planes from Kyushu were most likely to fly. On that morning of April 6th, all was quiet in the skies above the Great Luchu, although Japanese scout planes in the northern Ryukyus had discovered TF-58's fast carrier forces and brought hundreds of fighters and bombers down on them. Half of them missed their target and flew on to Okinawa, while the other half zeroed in on Rear Admiral Joseph Jocko Clark's task group 58.1. They hit the carrier Hancock and 2 destroyers, and a kamikaze Judy bomber almost sent the big flat-top Bennington to a watery grave. Plunging at the American's stern, the suicider was shot to bits by all of Bennington's ack-ack that could be brought to bear. When the Judy exploded astern, parts of her engine fragments fell in a shower on the carrier, temporarily disabling her rudder. Later in the day, Yokoi's fighters arrived off Okinawa's airfields and were intercepted by American fighters on patrol above them. At 3 o'clock, with the Yankee fighters presumably driven from the area, the suiciders struck. They dove on the pickets of the radar screen and that forest of masts in Hagushi anchorage. Some 200 of them came plummeting down for 5 hours until darkness veiled the sea or magnified the funeral pyres of stricken American ships. Destroyers Bush and Colquhoun were sunk. Colquhoun hit and staggered so frequently that she had to be abandoned and sunk by friendly fire. The ammunition ships Logan Victory and Hobbs Victory also went down, creating a temporary ordnance shortage for the 10th Army. 9 other destroyers were damaged, as were 4 destroyer escorts and 5 mine vessels. It was an impressive day's work for the first sally of the Kikusui, even though they had lost 135 planes. But the kamikaze reports were as usual exaggerated, rivaling even those of the 32nd Army, claiming 30 American ships sunk and 20 more burning. Such bloated estimates so encouraged Admirals Ugaki and Toyoda that the Navy chief began to think that perhaps the world's first suicide battleship, Great Yamato, might really stagger the Americans during its one-way voyage to Okinawa and eternal glory. Yamato, named for the clan generally credited with founding the Japanese nation, was not only the most powerful battleship afloat, but also the most beautiful. On April 6th, while hundreds of kamikaze roared down from the north, Yamato came trailing afterward in the spreading white majesty of her mighty bow wave. Yamato had survived the Battle of Leyte Gulf, where her sister Musashi had not. Yamato could outshoot anything in the U.S. Navy. She had 9 18.1-inch guns firing a projectile weighing 3,200 pounds a distance of 45,000 yards, compared to the 2,700-pound shell and 42,000-yard range of the American 16 inches. She displaced 72,809 tons fully laden and drew 35 feet. She was 863 feet long and 128 in the beam. She could hit 27.5 knots at top speed or cruise 7,200 miles at 16 knots, and she was sorting out of the inland sea for Okinawa with only enough fuel in her tanks for a one-way voyage. If soldiers and tanks, flyers and airplanes, sailors and boats could be enrolled in the ranks of the suiciders, It was logical that admirals and dreadnoughts should follow. There were 3 admirals coming with Yamato, and the light cruiser Yahagi and 8 destroyers. There might have been more of them and more warships, but Admiral Toyoda could scrape up only 2,500 tons of fuel for the venture. Although Toyoda had high hopes for the success of the Kikusui, he could not have regarded Yamato's sally as anything but a forlorn hope. He gave Rear Admiral Seiichi Ito, commanding this surface special attack force, only 2 airplanes for protection. If it was the good fortune of Yamato and company to reach Okinawa unscathed, or at least with the huge battle wagon and a few other ships intact, their mission was to fall like wolves upon the sheep of the American troop transports and supply ships in the Hagushi anchorage, and then, with their fuel almost exhausted, beach themselves to support a sally by Ushijima's 32nd Army with all their guns led by Yamato's 18 inches. At 3:20 on the afternoon of April 6th, exactly 20 minutes after the first of the floating chrysanthemums dove on the Hagushi targets, Yamato and her escorts shoved off from Tokuyama. There had been a ceremony. At 6 o'clock, all men and officers not on duty had been broken out on deck. A message from Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, chief victim of the Americans' Mariana's turkey shoot, was read. "Render this operation the turning point of the war." The men sang the somber national anthem, Umi Yukaba. Across the sea, corpses in the water, across the mountain, corpses in the field. I shall die for the Emperor. I shall never look back. Next, the ship's company, convinced to the man that they would never survive this voyage, gave 3 banzais for the Emperor and returned to quarters. At 10 o'clock, Yamato was in the Pacific Ocean, racing down Kyushu's eastern shores with her consorts gathering about her, shooing the American submarine Hackleback away, swinging to starboard off Kyushu's southern nose to sail west through Van Diemen Strait into the East China Sea. Admiral Ito was taking the surface special attack force on a big swing west-northwest in hopes of pouncing on the Americans off Okinawa at about dusk of the next day. But Hackleback had already alerted Admiral Spruance, and shortly before 8:30 the next morning, a scout plane from Essex spotted the Japanese force just southwest of Kyushu, less than 400 miles above Okinawa. Patrol planes began taking off from Keramaretto. At 10 o'clock, Yamato's pathetic pair of fighter escorts flew back to Japan. At 10:30, Rear Admiral Morton Deo was ordered to take 6 battleships, 7 cruisers, and 21 destroyers north, and place them between the approaching Japanese warships and the American transports. At almost the same moment, the patrol planes found Yamato sailing at 22 knots in the middle of a diamond-shaped destroyer screen, with cruiser Yahagi trailing behind. The big planes shadowed the naked enemy fleet like vultures. "Hope you will bring back a nice fish for breakfast," Admiral Turner signalled Admiral Deo. The commander of the intercepting force seized a signal blank and pencil to write his reply. "Many thanks, we'll try." An orderly handed him an intercepted message. Scouts of the fast carrier forces had found the enemy. 3 groups totaling 380 planes were preparing to strike. "We'll try to," Deo concluded, "if the Pelicans haven't caught them all." The Pelicans had. At 12:30, the American warbirds were over the target. 10 minutes later, 2 bombs exploded near Yamato's main mast. Another 4 minutes and a torpedo had pierced her side. At the same moment, destroyer Hamikaze stood on her nose and slid under, and Yahagi took a bomb and a fish and went dead in the water. There was a respite. The Americans came again at 1:30 and planted 5 torpedoes in Yamato's port side. Water rushed into boiler and engine rooms, and the stricken Mammoth began to lean to port. Rear Admiral Kosaku Ariga, Yamato's captain, ordered counter-flooding in the starboard boiler and engine rooms. Ensign Mitsuru Yoshida attempted to warn the men there. Too late. They were sacrificed. Still Yamato listed, and she had but 1 screw working. Her decks were a shambles of cracked and twisted steel plates. Her big guns would not work. The watertight wireless room was filled with water, and an explosion had wrecked the emergency dispensary and killed everyone inside. At 2 o'clock, the final attack began. Hellcats and Avengers plunged from the skies to strike at the hapless ship. Yamato was shaken fore and aft, and the entire battleship shuddered violently. Communications with the bridge were cut off, the distress flag was hoisted, the steering room became flooded, and with the rudder jammed hard left, mighty Yamato sagged over to a list of 35 degrees. "Correction of list hopeless," the executive officer cried. Down came the Americans for the death blow. "Hold on, men!" Ariga shouted. "Hold on, men!" Bombs were striking around and upon Yamato, raising a giant clanging, flinging waves of roaring air across her decks, jumbling men together in heaps. Out of one pile crawled high-ranking staff officers. Admiral Ito struggled to his feet. His chief of staff arose and saluted him. The two men regarded each other solemnly. Ito turned, shook hands with each of his staff officers, wheeled and strode into his cabin, either to embrace death or await it. The world will never know which. Admiral Ariga rushed to save the Emperor's portrait, but met death instead. Yamato was dying slowly, like the giant she was. Her decks were nearly vertical, her battle flag all but touched the waves, explosions racked her monster body. Her own ammunition began blowing up, and all around her were her sister ships in death agonies. Yahagi was sinking. Isokaze, Hamakaze, Asashimo, and Kasumo had received their death blows. At 23 minutes after 2, Yamato slid under, a full day's steaming from Okinawa. Japan had lost her navy, the suicide battleship had failed, and it was now up to the Kikusui and the men of Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima. The honeymoon had been brief for Major General John Hodges' 24th Corps, hardly more than a weekend. The day after Love Day, the 24th's spearheads raced across the island, 7th Division on the left, 96th on the right, turning to their right, or south, the next day for the anticipated rapid down-island advance. Their progress seemed as bloodless as the Marine Drive in the north, but on April 4th they found resistance, stiffening. It grew stiffer daily until, on April 8th, greatly increased resistance was reported. They had come into the outer works of Ushijima's Naha Shuriyonabaru line, and probably its most formidable position, Kakazu Ridge. At first glance, Kakasu, pronounced Kokazu, did not seem especially difficult, neither unusually high nor uncommonly steep. 3/4 of a mile south the Urasoe-Mura escarpment seemed a much more difficult natural barrier. That was what Colonel Eddie May thought when he prepared to send his 383rd Regiment of the 96th Division against it. Studying Kakazu from his headquarters atop another ridge, he considered its seizure a preliminary to an assault on Urasoe-Mura. His maps suggested no other conclusion, although Colonel May was not aware that the map was probably made from photographs taken when the entire area was obscured by clouds. Kakazu was a rough coral hogback about 1,000 yards long, running from the coastal flats in the west on a northwest-southeast keel. It was formed by two hills of the smaller Kakazu West on May's right flank, and the larger Kakazu Ridge proper to his left. What Colonel May and General Hodges also could not suspect was that Kakazu's defenders under Colonel Munetatsu Hara had been fortifying their position for months. Assisted by Okinawan labourers, they had constructed a subterranean honeycomb of caves, tunnels, and passageways. This would not be the first such impregnable position encountered by Americans in the Pacific War. What made it unique was its complete camouflage, its incredible variety and number of fortified positions, its depth, its abundance of supplies and ammunition, including a Spigot mortar unit launching huge 320mm shells, its network of mutually supporting emplacements firing interlocking fire, and its absolute invulnerability to those 1,900-pound shells hurled at it by the battleship Colorado cruising offshore. Because Colonel Hara had buried his headquarters deep below the main ridge, he had complicated his communications, his only problem. although many tunnels had interconnecting passages, and there were also voice tubes. Some underground positions were isolated, compelling Hara to use runners who would be exposed to enemy fire once they appeared above ground. Hara had no fear of the Americans' plentiful and powerful tanks, so superior to the Japanese diminutive kitchen sinks, that had been nevertheless unstoppable against inferior or lightly armed troops in the Manchuria-Burma-Philippines campaigns. Fronting Kakazu Ridge and running its entire length was a deep gorge cut into the coral by the immemorial passage of a narrow stream. The gorge was a natural anti-tank obstacle, impassable to tracked vehicles. For tanks to attempt to turn either flank of the ridge would bring down on them a storm of artillery. Finally, Colonel Hara had emplaced outposts in tombs and concrete pillboxes on the ridge's northern face. Most effective of all, he had cleverly emplaced most of his infantry and all of his mortars on the southern or reverse slope of the ridge. They were thus in untouchable defilade, shielded from enemy troops, artillery, and even American battleships. Not even enemy mortars, with that weapon's high, looping trajectory, could reach them. Moreover, the Americans were absolutely unaware of this reverse slope concentration, while Hara, of course, had his entire front registered by his own guns. Thus, Kakazu Ridge. Colonel May was sometimes called a soldier of the old school, meaning that he believed that the brave charge could usually carry the day. This does not suggest that he would not manoeuvre, only that faced by such a forbidding unflankable position, he would instinctively fall back on the frontal assault. So he ordered 2 of his 3 battalions to storm Kakazu Ridge and Kakuzu West on April 9th, actually expecting both to fall by the following morning. This meant that, in accordance with American infantry doctrine, a battalion of 3 companies would use 2 of them in attack with the 3rd in reserve, and thus 2 companies would strike the main ridge and 2 more Kakazu West, with the remaining 2 on call in their rear. To achieve surprise, there would be no artillery preparation beforehand, and all units would attack before daylight. Right at the start, one of the companies assaulting Kakazu West was late moving out and did not march until daylight, when it was sighted and promptly pinned down. The other company was commanded by a born fighter and leader, First Lieutenant Willard Mitchell, a powerfully built Southerner who had played both football and basketball for Mississippi State. Idolized by his men and called Captain Hoss, he was also beloved for his unbashful battle cry, "Watch out! Here comes the Hoss, and God is on the Hoss's side." Mitchell returned their affection by calling them his Lardasses, a fondly derisive and droll nickname that they loved. Mitchell's Lardasses were quick to ascend Kakazu West under cover of darkness, and not particularly dismayed to learn that they were alone on its crest and that their supporting comrades were pinned down below. They also found that the position was composed of 2 knolls, one on the north and the other to the south, forming Colonel Hara's reverse slope. Between them was a shallow saddle of land. The moment that the Japanese emerged from their steel and coral fortress, Mitchell quickly formed his company into a perimeter on the saddle, just deep enough to conceal a prone man. He hoped to riddle them if they charged forward to clear both saddle and northward knoll. But the enemy refused to oblige, opening fire from their own position and showering the saddle with hand grenades and satchel charges, bags stuffed with explosive. Mitchell's men fought back with the same weapons, and a furious battle raged back and forth all morning long, with men killed and wounded on both sides. Throughout the action, Mitchell roved the besieged saddle, hurling grenades and firing his carbine, his battle cry booming from his lips. His men were his gallant equal, and one of them, PFC, Joseph Solch, spotted an enemy spigot mortar mounted in a cave on the reverse slope. Just one of its 320mm shells could destroy the Americans on the saddle. With Captain Hoss, Solch and his buddies attacked the huge mortar, destroying it with hand grenades and killing its 9-man crew. At about noon, sensing that the Americans had but a small force in front of him, Colonel Hara ordered his men to make a series of 4 furious counterattacks on the enemy. so that they might surprise the Americans, and with brutal indifference to their destruction or survival, he sent them charging through his own mortar fire. Lieutenant Bill Curran killed both the leaders of the first charge, while his men repulsed the Japanese with heavy loss. When a second assault came, Solch, squatting on his haunches, fired his Browning automatic rifle, BAR, from the hip to repel an entire company. In the final charge, the Japanese, throwing satchel charges as big as boxes of apples, came within a few feet of overrunning the American Devils, but finally fell a few feet short. Even so, Mitchell's company was being badly whittled. Because his soldiers were lying on hard coral, they could not get below ground by scooping out foxholes, and thus were inviting targets for enemy riflemen and exposed to the flame and fragments of exploding mortar shells. Fierce fighting also raged atop Kakazu Ridge to the east, or left of Mitchell's position. Here the Japanese popped in and out of their barricaded caves to strike the men of companies led by Captain Jack Royster and First Lieutenant Dave Bellman. They also charged up the reverse slope, again braving their own mortars. An entire American platoon was pinned down by a pair of enemy machine guns. PFC. Edward Moscala crawled toward them, clutching his bar. When close enough but still unobserved, he hurled grenades at the unsuspecting Japanese, rising to rush them, spraying bullets. Both guns were knocked out. Now Lieutenant Bellman was hit, refusing evacuation despite great loss of blood. Captain Royster took a mortar fragment in the face. In exquisite pain and nearly blind, he also refused to leave. But it was becoming plain to both officers that the enemy was gaining the upper hand. GIs had already begun to withdraw off the ridge crest, hunting protection in the numerous caves and holes on the ridge's northern face. After Royster radioed battalion for help, Lieutenant Colonel King ordered another company to the rescue. But this unit got no farther than the gorge, crouching with the men who had been pinned down there since sunup. King now believed that his battalion was in trouble and asked May for permission to withdraw. May refused, telling King that he'd lose as many men withdrawing as he would holding the hill. He also told him that if he was jumpy, have the executive officer take over. Understandably, there was no reply. Captain Royster on the ridge had a far better appreciation of his danger than either hard-boiled Eddie May or the cautious Colonel King. His and Bellman's company could not possibly retreat in full view of the enemy. So Royster called for smoke shells from the 88th Chemical Mortar Battalion. They went humming up and looping down, but the wind blew them back into Royster's face. Eventually there was enough smoke to conceal a withdrawal, and the GIs began crawling down toward the gorge, many of them carrying wounded buddies with them. Ed Moscala was the last man down, but when he learned that a wounded man unable to move was still atop the ridge, he went back up to bring him safely down. Now the remnants of King's entire battalion were pinned down in the gorge, immobilized by enemy fire. To leap erect was to die. Second Lieutenant Leo Ford, the officer now in charge, decided that the best way out was to creep down the defile to the jump-off point of Hoss Mitchell's company earlier in the day. Snaking along inch by inch on their bellies, dragging their wounded, Ford and his men moved westward at a snail's pace. Ed Moscala, who had volunteered again to act as rear guard, covered their withdrawal. Twice he rescued wounded buddies, but on his second trip he paid for his gallantry with his life. For these acts of infinite compassion and his bravery in destroying the enemy guns, Moscala received the posthumous award of the Medal of Honor. By 4 in the afternoon, the men led by Ford reached a point opposite the north slope of Kakazu West, and were soon joined by Mitchell's GIs moving rapidly under billowing smoke skillfully called down by Captain Hoss himself. The Kakazu attack had failed, but it had not been a disaster. In all, Colonel May's 383rd Regiment had suffered 326 casualties, with 23 dead, 47 missing and presumed dead, plus 256 wounded. Colonel Hara's command may have lost half of its strength of 1,200, and for the defenders to lose nearly twice as many as the attackers while fighting from a most formidable fixed position testifies to the valor and skill of the American infantry. Even before the failure at Kakazu became known at 96th Division headquarters, Brigadier Claudius Easley, assistant commander of the 96th, had prepared a second much more massive assault under his personal command. This powerhouse attack, with no attempt at surprise, was to be spearheaded by 4 battalions of infantry, about 3,000 soldiers, supported by 8 battalions of 105 and 155mm artillery, together with airstrikes and bombardment from the sea led by the battleship New York. There would be no tanks once again, for that gorge below the ridge was still impassable. At 7:15 a.m. on April 10th, the assault began. Furious as the preliminary bombardment had been, it in no way depleted Ushijima's troop strength. When the bombardment lifted, his men, safe and invisible within his steel and coral fortress, would reply with small arms, machine guns, mortars, and occasionally one of those huge 624-pound mortar shells. Once again the 96th fought gallantly, but flesh and blood advancing in the open, no matter how valiantly, simply cannot overcome an unseen enemy firing from within underground fortifications of steel and coral. It was almost as though the Japanese and the Americans had exchanged battle doctrines, the defenders relying upon firepower and the invaders on spiritual power, with the inevitable consequence: the Americans were stopped. Fortunately for them, a heavy rain, the forerunner of drenching downpours soon to come, squelched the battle, or their casualties might have been greater. It required 2 more days of hideous combat to convince General Easley that Kakazu was simply too formidable for the 96th to conquer alone. On April 11th, Colonel John Cassidy's battalion of the 381st Regiment made its second attempt to seize the top of the ridge and was again driven back. That night, the Japanese began bombarding the Americans pinned down in the gorge with their 320mm spigot mortars. One of these huge projectiles, woefully inaccurate and fired so haphazardly, seemingly did strike harmlessly on the ground, but with enough force to start a landslide that buried a cave being used as an aid station, killing 13 Americans and wounding 9. On the morning of the 12th, Easley ordered another attack by Cassidy's battalion, supported by heavy airstrikes. When the 96th moved out, there fell upon them a shower of mortar shells so thick that they came down at the rate of better than 60 a minute. 45 men were lost, and that was the end of the Kakazu debacle of April 9-12. During the failed April 9-12 assaults, the only appreciable gains made by the 24th Corps was by the veteran 7th Infantry Division on the left or eastern flank of the 96th. From Triangulation Hill to Uki on Nakagusuku Bay, the 7th drove forward 1,000 yards. Uki fell to the 32nd Infantry on April 11th, but the Americans were promptly evicted. By the night of April 12th, all of the 7th's formations were halted in front of Hill 178, a towering crag in roughly the centre-east of Ushijima S-Line, which was also a Japanese artillery observation point. Farther east, the 96th 382nd Regiment had been stopped cold at Tombstone Ridge, where on April 11th it went into defensive positions. Tombstone may have been every bit as tough as Kakazu, but no assault was planned until General Hodge and his division commanders could assess the situation. Casualties in the 7th and 96th Divisions had been 451 dead, with 241 missing and presumed dead and 2,198 wounded, for a total of 2,890. Enemy losses were estimated at 5,650, all killed, although this was almost certainly exaggerated. A truer figure more likely would be about 4,000. Most of these men were killed by bombardment, for during April 9-12, the American invaders had hurled a massive weight of metal from land, sea, and air upon the defending Japanese. The fact that Kakazu, Tombstone, and Uki remained in enemy hands demonstrated to the American commanders that the key to success on Okinawa lay in possession of the reverse slopes of all those ridges from Kakazu to Shuri Castle. Seizing the forward slopes, though difficult, could be done, but any attempt to drive past them would bring upon the attackers that dreadful rain of enemy fire. What was needed, it seemed to General Hodge, was even heavier bombardments, and there was not yet enough ammunition ashore. The loss of those 2 ammunition ships to the kamikaze, deemed not critical at first, was now one of the chief causes of delay. Kakazu would have to wait until enough 105 and 155mm shells had come across the beaches to make sustained daily shelling a reality. Already, after only about 9 days of battle, it had become apparent that the Okinawa campaign would depend upon supply as much as battle. Back to Banzai. Chapter 12. Reports of the Battle of Kakazu Ridge were received by Lieutenant General Isamu Cho, he had received another star, and Colonel Hiromichi Yahara with predictable reactions. Although neither knew the exact number of enemy fallen or even their own losses, Yahara was eminently pleased with the result. The Americans had been dealt a bloody repulse exactly as he had planned in his defence-in-depth tactics, and soon the rate of attrition among them would so whittle the 10th Army that the Americans would cancel their offensive so that not only the homeland would be saved, but Okinawa as well. To General Cho it appeared that the enemy had suffered grievously and was so rocked back on their heels that the time had come for a full-scale offensive of the 32nd Army. Since his humiliation in the earlier showdown between him and Yahara, when General Ushijima had sided with his planning chief, the fiery Cho had not ceased to press for a counterattack, but even his friend and mentor Ushijima remained unmoved, until an order from Imperial headquarters was received, urging the 32nd Army to overrun Yontan and Kadena airfields. This was probably the result of a Japanese intelligence warning that Marine corsairs would soon arrive at these airfields in strength, and would make the mission of the various Kikusui more difficult than ever. Cho seized on this directive to persuade Ushijima on April 6th to order an attack prepared for April 8th. But the ever-alert Yahara pounced upon the appearance of a 110-ship convoy offshore of the Uraso-Mura escarpment on April 7th as proof that the Americans were going to strike the 62nd Division on its flank. Alarmed, Ushijima for the second time cancelled a Cho-sponsored assault. But then both the American failure at Kakazu Ridge and the remarkable destruction wrought upon the enemy fleet by the first of the Kikusui convinced Ushijima and Cho that the time to strike had indeed come. This misconception was strengthened by a stirring telegraph order from naval headquarters claiming that Tengo had been very successful. There are signs of uneasiness among enemy forces, and odds are 7-3 in our favour. Everyone involved in the Okinawa defence should unite in a general pursuit operation. Isamu Cho, though not as rational as his rival Yahara, was at least as clever. Everywhere he seemed to see signs of enemy weakness, among them slackening aerial activity on April 10th, as well as a Navy report of a reduction in the number of American ships in the Hagushi anchorage. The calculating Yahara could have explained the first as a result of the same cloudy, rainy weather that discomfited everyone on the island, Cho included, and the second as caused by the visible stream of unloaded enemy ships sailing back to base for reloading and return. But Cho was then at his argumentative best, and over the precise but uninspiring protests of the unhappy Yahara, General Ushijima ordered a powerful counterattack for the night of April 12th on 13. Cho's plan was for massive infiltration of almost the entire east-west front of the US 7th and 96th Divisions. 3 battalions of the Japanese 24th Division would strike the 7th on the east, or right of the American line, while 3 more from the 62nd Division would assault the battered 96th. They would, of course, attack at night, a Japanese preference born of a desire to negate that dreaded American artillery. Breaking through the advance American units, the troops would then spread out in the rear area to a point 4 miles below Kadena Airfield. There they would take refuge in known caves and tombs. On the morning of April 13th, they would emerge to slaughter 10th Army's rear echelon troops, usually technical, headquarters, supply and soldiers armed with nothing more lethal than a pencil. In the melee that would ensue, troops of both sides would be so hopelessly intermixed that the enemy would not dare to bring his artillery, air, and naval gunfire to bear. Meanwhile, other battalions remaining in place opposite the 7th and 96th would launch a furious attack intended to compel the Yankees to retreat, perhaps in such panic that they would be included in the general slaughter of the enemy's rear echelon. Cho did not specify what would happen next, whether he intended actually to overrun the airfields as Imperial headquarters had suggested, destroying installations and aircraft at will, or would be content merely with unnerving Buckner and disorganizing his 2 forward divisions. With troops marching in drenching rain to their jump-off positions on April 12th, Hiromichi Yahara became so apprehensive that he committed an act of insubordination so incredible that in any Western army it could not have ended otherwise than in a court-martial and dismissal, or perhaps worse. He went to Lieutenant General Takeo Fujioka, commander of the 62nd Division, and Lieutenant General Tatsumi Amamiya, commander of the 24th, and actually persuaded them not to use 3 battalions each in the forthcoming operation, but only 2. Not 6, but 4 battalions would march to the plan of Isamu Cho. 3 flares burst over Kakazu Ridge during the early darkness of April 12th. 2 were red, the first signalling, "Commence artillery fire," and the other, "We are attacking with full strength tonight," and the third, shaped like a dragon, was for "Make all-out attack." Almost instantly, at about 7 p.m., there fell on the Americans the heaviest Japanese artillery concentration of the war. On the sector of the battered 96th alone, about 2,200 rounds exploded, while within 5 minutes another 200 rocked the 7th zone. Fortunately, these Yankees, with their painfully acquired battle savvy, had dug their holes so dry and deep that few casualties resulted. First to strike the Americans was the 22nd Infantry Regiment, which had marched for 2 days in pouring rain from its base on Oroku Peninsula just south of Naha. Loaded down with 110-pound packs and bags of food, an immense burden for these normally small soldiers, they had been told by their commander, Lieutenant Colonel Masaru Yoshida, to move in a sinuous eel line, and they did indeed feel more like fish than flesh as they lay huddled and shivering in cane fields to escape detection by enemy air. By nightfall they were already dispirited and bewildered, moving over unfamiliar terrain and with no precise plan. Instead of attacking en masse, they sought to infiltrate the 7th Division's sector in 2s or 3s, or a squad or 2, but got nowhere. One massed attack of about 100 Japanese was riddled by GIs firing rifles and machine guns, killing about a third of them, wounding another third, and compelling all survivors to take refuge in a cave. The assault on the 96th Division's front, however, was much heavier, better organized, and of longer duration, personally directed as it was by General Fujioka. Guileful and stealthy as always, a long column of Japanese sought to penetrate the 96th's position by pretending to be GIs marching openly down Highway 5 in a column of 2s. 20 of them slipped past scrutiny until the Americans, realizing that they were not friendly troops on their flank, opened fire with all weapons. Those who survived scurried for cover in caves and tombs, but 58 of their comrades were left dead on the field. 2 more attacks were mounted against the 96th, but both failed with heavy loss. General Fujioka next tried to roll up his enemy with 2 companies following an artillery barrage against Kakazu Ridge. A small force staged a diversion around the western flank of Kakazu West, while the main body tried to overrun the draw between that point and Kakazu Ridge. First to meet them was PFC, William Daly at the trigger of a heavy machine gun in the draw. Unable to depress his gun enough to strike the approaching enemy below him, Daly began tossing grenades. Their explosions alerted Staff Sergeant Beaufort Snuffy Anderson, holed up in a tomb with his light mortar section. Anderson left the tomb to hurl all of his grenades at the Japanese, and then emptied his carbine. Glancing about him, his eye fell on a dud enemy mortar. Seizing it, he spiraled it football style into the drawer and was rewarded by an explosion and screams. Rushing back into the tomb, he collected his own mortars, wrenched them from their casings, yanked out the safety pins, slamming the shell against a rock to release the setback pin, and spiraled this heavier and more lethal football into the drawer. Again an explosion and screams. With this impromptu passing attack, Anderson sent all of his 15 lethal footballs spinning into the darkness below, and by this effective exercise in Yankee battle ingenuity, he stopped an entire enemy platoon. In the morning he counted 25 enemy bodies, plus 7 abandoned knee mortars and 4 machine guns. For his bravery and quickness of thought, Anderson received the Medal of Honor. Other Japanese who had infiltrated Kakazu West met the same end. When an enemy officer approached a barman and asked him if he were Japanese, the GI snorted, "No," and shot him dead, along with 10 of his men following in single file. Soldiers of a company command post under attack in a tomb sallied forth to kill 20 Japanese. On the western slope of Kakazu West, a single American machine gunner mowed down 23 more sons of Nippon. Another enemy force nearly broke through the drawer, until they were illuminated by star shells fired over the battlefield by American warships offshore, a technique developed at Peleliu, and so successful that night actually could be turned into day. Silhouetted against the dark, the enemy was easily riddled and their attack broken in blood. Dawn revealed a drawer covered with sprawling corpses. General Cho's desperation attack was also hurled back on Kakazu Ridge proper. When the 96th's heavy mortar crews were informed that about 40 Japanese were threatening to overrun their battalion observation post, they decided to risk close support of their rifleman buddies up front. Hoping that their comrades would be safely below ground in pits and foxholes, they sent about 800 high-explosive shells humming skyward to come plunging straight down with a horrible whistling noise that was the last sound many Japanese ever heard. Marine artillery also joined the bombardment, firing shells that drew a curtain of explosives around the endangered position. In the morning, enemy dead were stacked like cordwood below. In their headquarters below Shuri Castle, a sorrowing General Ushijima and a despairing General Cho heard nothing but depressing reports from the front. Nevertheless, it was still hoped that a battalion of the 22nd Regiment that had slipped through American lines undetected to enter the Ginowan area might hide out in caves until daybreak, when they could emerge to shoot up the American rear echelons, and even perhaps reach Yontan and Kadena to destroy enemy aircraft. But in scattering for sanctuary during the night, they had become so fragmented that daybreak showed them incapable of concerted action. So they remained hidden until nightfall of the 13th, when half of them successfully slipped back into their own lines. 2 final Japanese counterattacks were repulsed during the early morning darkness of the 14th, one of them with losses of 116 men, closing out Isamu Cho's abortive counter-offensive. It had not, of course, been a proper banzai. Howling, sake-crazed troops, screaming and screeching as they ran through the darkness, banging canteens on bayonets and yelling in sing-song English what they presumed to be blood-curdling oaths. Japanese boy drink American boy's blood, only to be herded into enemy barbed wire by American mortars falling behind them, there to be riddled or sometimes even exterminated by accurate machine gun and rifle fire. But it was still a reversion to bamboo spear tactics, and worse, a decision to come outside of the caves and tombs and pillboxes, from which they had successfully halted the 2-division advance of General Hodges' 24th Corps, and expose themselves to the devastation of overwhelmingly superior American artillery, mortar, and naval gunfire, as well as accurate small arms. Ushijima, in authorizing this romantic regression into the failed tactics of the past, had blessed an operation ill-conceived, understrength, misdirected, haphazard, and uncoordinated. As a result, more than half the force involved, 1,594 men, were killed. to approve a plan calling for splendid defensive fighters to take the offensive at night while moving over unfamiliar terrain and woefully inferior in numbers and firepower was simply to grasp the muzzle of military success rather than the pistol grip, and also to surrender his own enormous advantage in terrain and tenacious troops, natural obstacles made unassailable by improved fortifications, thus cancelling out his enemy's superior firepower, and manned by invisible troops movable only in death. He did this because, like Isamu Cho, his heart had conquered his head, and because most Japanese commanders from Midway Guadalcanal to Okinawa itself could never shed that Bushido-born, carefully cultivated conviction that the soft, spoiled, luxury-loving Americans would quail at the first flash of a samurai sabre. Admiral Matome Ugaki was still convinced that his April 6-7 strikes at the Americans had seriously damaged TF-58, an estimate not shared by his colleague, Lieutenant General Michio Sugahara of the 6th Air Army. A report made by Sugahara's staff somewhat sourly concluded, "Despite many attacks, the Navy cannot block the enemy's carrier force, which still is operating east of Okinawa." Nevertheless, Sugahara was eminently cooperative in preparing for Kikusui II, which Ugaki hoped would so shatter Spruance's fleet that it might seek sanctuary in the open sea. But both he and the army general realized that the second floating chrysanthemum would never equal the strength of the first, if only because of the serious losses it had suffered. They were also concerned to learn that marine corsairs had indeed arrived at Yontan and Kadena, thus menacing their own aircraft with ground-based fighters that, because of their proximity to their base, were more to be feared than carrier-based interceptors. Their apprehension was somewhat eased, however, with the arrival on Kyushu of a new weapon, the Oka, or cherry blossom glide bomb, a rocket-boosted, piloted suicider capable of speeds of 500 knots and carrying a huge wallop of 2,645 pounds of trinitroaniline. The Oka was slung beneath a mother plane, usually a heavy Betty or Peggy bomber, and flown to within about a dozen miles of its target, when it was released with the pilot firing its rockets and directing it toward its target. Moving at pistol bullet speed, the Oka was believed to be almost immune to enemy gunfire, but its very velocity made it extremely difficult for its pilot to keep his 16 1-2-foot missile on target. American intelligence was aware of the appearance of this new weapon, but considered it so ineffective that it was christened Baka, or foolish. Although Kikusui II was scheduled for April 12th, Admiral Ugaki tried to destroy the remnant of TF-58 on the day before, hurling a daylight suicide attack of about 52 planes against Admiral Mitcher's carrier force. Typically, glowing reports claimed 3 carriers sunk, a cruiser set ablaze, another cruiser holed, and 2 destroyers hit with torpedoes. The next day, Ugaki's pilots, still mightier with pen than bomb, reported sinking 2 battleships and a light cruiser. Actually, very little damage was done to Mitcher's ships on either day. Some damage was inflicted on the veteran flat-top Enterprise, and a kamikaze crashed the majestic new battleship Missouri, but succeeded only in scratching her deck and blistering some paint. Destroyer Kidd was hit on picket duty and badly hurt, with 38 sailors killed and 55 wounded, the worst casualty of the day. Waggish bluejackets aboard another picket destroyer, exasperated by repeated strikes at their station, erected a huge sign on deck with an arrow pointing aft and reading, "Carriers this way." Both Ugaki and Sugahara hoped to neutralize the enemy corsairs by planning a series of bombing raids on their airfields the night before the scheduled attacks of April 12th, while Sugahara also organized a decoy flight of fighters to lure TF-58's Hellcats and Corsairs away from the impact area. In the bombing operation, 22 Japanese aircraft struck Yontan and Kadena shortly before dawn of the 12th, damaging 5 enemy planes but losing 5 of their own to American gunners of all services. Next, Sugahara's decoys attracted nothing but birds rising for dawn breakfasts, so that it was not until 11 o'clock in the morning that the Kyushu main body of about 120 late-model fighters arrived over both Kikai-jima and the Hagushi anchorage to try to clear the strike area for following flights of 76 kamikaze, plus 20 suiciders roaring up from Formosa. Although the Nipponese fighters were more successful than usual against the more skillful Americans flying better planes, claiming a probably exaggerated 20 kills, the Navy and Marine pilots from the carriers of TF-58 reported a much higher 126 enemy planes downed during fighter sweeps. This also was probably exaggerated, not by intent like the starry-eyed enemy, but from the inevitable duplication occurring when more than one fighter was firing on the same enemy, or even when a flamer plunging toward a watery grave might have the winds caused by his velocity blow the fires out, enabling him to return successfully to base. Kill estimates like body counts were much like American taxpayers' income tax returns, so full of deductions for charity that the churches of America would all be rich beyond the dreams of avarice. But the American interceptors did effectively prevent the enemy fighters from protecting the kamikaze. Although the suiciders succeeded in damaging 8 American ships, mostly destroyers and destroyer escorts of the radar picket line, as well as some smaller craft, and causing high casualties, only one warship was sunk, the new picket destroyer Manert El Abele, the first kill on record by a Baka bomb. Abele was on picket station 14, about 30 miles west of Okinawa, when it was jumped by a pair of suicide vals. Abele's AA opened up, each burst seemingly scoring a hit but with the planes reappearing through the smoke. One of the attackers was sent into the sea, but the second struck the destroyer's after engine room, spreading death and destruction and causing Abele to buckle visibly. Just then, one of 2 Betty bombers circling like scavengers overhead released its Baka bomb, which came shrieking at the stricken destroyer at 500 knots. The pilot kept his missile perfectly on course, striking Abele exactly amidships. A tremendous blast lifted the American out of the water to be slammed back again. Many men were blown overboard, among them Lieutenant S.G. George Ray, who swam back to his ship, clambering aboard to tear open a jammed escape hatch, allowing the entire watch of the forward engine room to scramble to safety. In less than another minute, Ray might have been too late, for Abele sank 5 minutes after the Baker struck.